Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hannah Jahani, and I'm a member of Students for Justice in Palestine at Brooklyn College. On behalf of our club, we would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Political Science Department, the Sociology Department, the English Department, the DC Bengal Club, the DC Daisy Cultural Club, the DC Dream Team, the DC Islamic Student Organization, the Park Slope Food Corporation members for BDS, Adala, New York, Brooklyn for Peace, New York Against Cornell Technion Partnership, Jews for the Palestinian Right of Return, New York City Against War, the Committee for Open Discussion of Zionism, Students for Justice in Palestine at Columbia, SJP at CSI, SJP at City College, SJP at Drew University, SJP at John Jay, SJP at NYU, and SJP at Rutgers, New York. We are happy and honored to host Josh Ruebner tonight. He is the National Advocacy Director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation.
Thank you, Hannah, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Students for Justice in Palestine for organizing and sponsoring tonight's event, and thanks to all of you for turning out on Wednesday evening to talk about what I think is a very fundamental and crucial issue, which is U.S. policy toward Israel and the Palestinian people, and specifically how this policy played itself out during President Obama's first term in office. But before I get to the heart of the issue, I think it's worthwhile to note that in the 20th century, we have seen the successful resolution of many different conflicts which were deemed to be extraordinarily complex, difficult to resolve, laden emotionally with different historical and religious and national claims. So, for example, in 1962, after France had occupied, annexed, and colonized Algeria for more than 130 years, and towards the end of an incredibly brutal war of national independence and liberation, in which France killed more than 1 million Algerian Muslims. In 1961, when the French premier Charles de Gaulle finally came to the conclusion that France could no longer dominate and control Algeria, he stood up before the people of France and he said that France should be for the French people, but Algeria should be for the Algerian people. Now, this was the signal needed by the FLN, the Front Libération Nationale, which was waging this war of national liberation and independence. This was a signal to the FLN that the time was ripe for resolving this conflict, that France had the political will to resolve this conflict on a just basis. And despite these 130 years of colonization and annexation and subjugation of Algerians by France, and despite the 1 million+ people killed by France in this war of liberation, when Charles de Gaulle uttered these words, they came to the negotiating table and within the span of 1 year negotiated a peace, leading to the decolonization and independence of Algeria. Now, we've seen other historical conflicts that have been resolved as well in the 20th century. Even more recently than the independence of Algeria, we've seen the end of 350 years of racial discrimination in South Africa, and more than 40 years of institutionalized governmental discrimination known as apartheid. Now, after the apartheid government in South Africa had become an international pariah because of its odious discriminatory regime toward the 90% of South Africans who were black, after South Africa had become this international pariah, it realized that it could no longer go on in this fashion, that it had to come to the table and negotiate a transition to a post-apartheid South Africa, a democratic South Africa. And despite more than 3 centuries of this discrimination, which was enforced brutally, when this decision was made, when the apartheid regime demonstrated a political conviction to resolve the conflict on a just basis, this was the signal to the ANC, the African National Congress, to come to the negotiating table. And within the span of just 3 years, the party successfully transitioned to a democratic South Africa. And in year 4 of this process, Nelson Mandela was elected South Africa's first ever democratic president. More recently than that, we've seen that more than 8 centuries of conflict in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics were resolved through a power-sharing agreement in 1998 known as the Good Friday Agreement. Now, why do I raise these few historical examples at the outset of this talk? I do so primarily for 2 reasons. Number one, we hear from the media, from pundits, from people who are intimately involved with the Israeli-Palestinian, quote, peace process, that there is something so intrinsically complex and difficult to resolve about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that necessitates and justifies its dragging on and on and on. Well, I don't think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is all that difficult to understand when you boil it down to its essence. Because what Israel has constructed over the totality of historic Palestine, meaning what we today call Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, what Israel has constructed on the totality of historic Palestine is a system of apartheid. Now, the international community adopted in the 1970s a treaty defining apartheid as a crime against humanity. And the way the international community defines this crime of apartheid is as follows. Any governmental system of laws and institutions and regulations that create a different set of standards of practices which privilege one group at the expense of another group, based on factors such as religion, nationality, ethnicity, race. This describes to a T Israel's self-declared policies toward the Palestinian people. Now, I think tomorrow when Ben White comes to campus, he'll do a much better job than me of explaining these apartheid policies, but let me give you just a brief preview and hopefully he'll corroborate what I have to say. When Israel was established in 1948, it was done so on 78% of historic Palestine. And in the process of establishing this state, Israel came to be a country with a majority of its inhabitants who are Jewish for one reason only. And that is because it engaged in a systematic and premeditated and deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing to drive out as many Palestinians from their homes as possible, from as much of historic Palestine as possible. Today, there are more than 5 million registered Palestinian refugees who live in refugee camps because Israel denies to them their internationally guaranteed right to return to their homes and their property. This is Article 9 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Any human being can leave his or her home for any reason, at any time, and return at any time and for any reason. And despite the fact that when Israel joined the United Nations in 1949, it signed an agreement stipulating that it would agree to abide by the implementation of Palestinian refugees' right of return, we are still waiting, more than 65 years later, for that promise to be fulfilled. Now, why aren't Palestinian refugees allowed to return to their homes and their properties? Because Israel deems them to be, quote, the wrong religion, the wrong nationality, the wrong ethnicity. But if you're a Jewish person from Brooklyn, you can pack up your bags and you can move to Israel tomorrow under what's called the law of return and claim Israeli citizenship on day one and enjoy all the rights and prerogatives and benefits of being an Israeli citizen. What is the distinction between Israel's denial of the right of return to Palestinian refugees and its acceptance of Jewish people for citizenship under the law of return? The differentiation is very clear. It's one based on religion, and it's based on nationality. Now, for those Palestinians who were not driven from their homes in 1948 and who stayed and became citizens of the government of Israel, today those Palestinians are 20% of Israel's population. Israel never has been solely a Jewish state in terms of the demographics of its population. And today those Palestinian citizens of Israel number 1.5 million. And to say that those Palestinian citizens of Israel are second-class citizens of the state, I think is to put it very generously. I think they're much less than second-class citizens. Israel is the only country in the world, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that does not have a nationality. What am I talking about that Israel doesn't have a nationality? Just last month, there was a lawsuit brought by a Palestinian citizen of Israel to the Israeli Supreme Court demanding that he be identified by Israeli nationality. And the Supreme Court rejected his petition. And they said, no, you do not have a right to an Israeli nationality. Instead, identity in the state of Israel is defined by your religion. That's what it says on your ID card. And there's different rights and responsibilities and obligations based on your religion. So yes, Palestinians can vote in the Israeli parliament, and yes, they can even run for office. And some are in the Israeli parliament. But that doesn't mean they're equal. So if you're Palestinian, you cannot rent land from the state of Israel, because the state of Israel is the only country in the world that doesn't control its land use. Instead, it's controlled by the Jewish National Fund, which is not a governmental agency, but a quasi-governmental agency, which subcontracts out the use of land. Now the JNF, for short, in its charter, says that the land of Israel is not for the benefit of the citizens of Israel. Instead, the land of Israel is for the exclusive benefit of the Jewish people worldwide, regardless of whether they're Israeli citizens or not. So, if you're Jewish, you can rent land from the JNF, but if you're Palestinian, sorry, you're out of luck. Even though you're a citizen of the state, you aren't allowed to rent land from the JNF because you're the wrong religion, the wrong nationality, the wrong ethnicity. This is a situation that obtains today in Israel. Now, in 1967, when Israel conquered the remaining 22% of historic Palestine, it did so and placed these territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, under a belligerent military occupation. That continues to this day, 46 years later. And under this regime, Palestinians have no political rights. The first military order that Israel promulgated upon occupying these Palestinian territories was to make it, quote, illegal for more than 10 Palestinians to gather at any time for any reason. They made it illegal for Palestinians to wave their national flag. They made it illegal for Palestinians to write articles in the Palestinian press that are critical of the state of Israel. So all of these ideas that we associate with the First Amendment and freedom of speech do not apply to Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation. Yet, for Israeli Jews who are colonizing this Palestinian land, there are no such restrictions. And again, the differentiation is one that's based solely on the religion or nationality or ethnicity of that group. So what we have is a comprehensive system of apartheid that Israel has established over the Palestinian people. And the problem with the peace process, and the reason why the peace process has not succeeded and will continue to fail, is because it has been premised not on ending these Israeli apartheid policies, but the opposite, in entrenching them, in enabling Israel's ongoing colonization of Palestinian land, of maintaining this notion that Israel should be a, quote, Jewish state that both discriminates against its Palestinian citizens and denies Palestinian refugees their right of return because they're of the wrong religion, the wrong nationality, the wrong ethnicity. The second reason why I raise these historical conflicts at the outset of the talk is because, as some of you may know, this September marked 20 years since Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization came together to sign the Declaration of Principles, more informally known as the Oslo Accords, based on the city in which these negotiations took place. Now, what was this, quote, Oslo peace process about? It set out a 5-year interim transition phase that was to have led to the signing of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And in year 3 of this process, they were supposed to sit down and negotiate all of the issues that are at the crux, at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The status of Jerusalem, the fate of Palestinian refugees, where to draw borders, how to divide water resources, etc., etc. The only problem was, instead of negotiating in good faith about these issues, Israel used this Oslo peace process as a cover, as a pretext, to go on an unprecedented expansion of its colonization of Palestinian land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and until 2005 in the Gaza Strip as well. Now, this situation changed somewhat in the summer of 2000, when the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak, said to U.S. President Bill Clinton, let's sit down and negotiate a resolution to this conflict once and for all. Bill Clinton thought this was a good idea. So he telephoned his friend Yasser Arafat, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and told him to come to Camp David to negotiate a summit that would lead to the resolution of this conflict. Now, Arafat said, look, President Clinton, there have been no negotiations on these issues. The gaps are like this. The experts, the technical experts, the ones who actually do the negotiations, have to sit down and narrow the gaps before the heads of state can come to an agreement. Now, this is diplomacy 101. Guess what? Heads of states don't negotiate. It's the technical experts who write the text of the treaty that gets signed, and the heads of states just come in to cross the T's, dot the I's, work out any last-minute wrinkles. So Arafat tried to explain all of this to Clinton. But Clinton said, don't worry, if these negotiations don't work, nobody will be blamed. So here they negotiate for 2 weeks, and we hear much about a supposed generous Israeli offer that was made to the Palestinians at Camp David. Do you know how many times the Palestinians were actually presented with an official map from Israel showing them what this generous offer consisted of? The answer is 0. The Palestinian negotiating team was never presented with a map showing them what this generous offer would be, besides the fact they would have no sovereignty in Jerusalem, and no Palestinian refugees would be allowed to return to their homes and their land. So what Arafat told Clinton was that if I sign this agreement, and this is a direct quote, I will go home and be assassinated, because it would have been a selling out of Palestinian individual and collective rights. Now, despite Clinton's pledge, less than 1 hour after these negotiations broke down, Clinton stood up at a podium at Camp David and he said, I blame Arafat and the Palestinians 100% for the breakdown of these negotiations. Now, what does this story have to do with President Barack Obama? The story took place a good 8-9 years before he entered the White House. Why do I raise it? I raise it because I think it really encapsulates and shows the extent to which the United States is not an honest broker to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is a key to understanding why this peace process has failed and will continue to fail. Now, I can't do a better job of convincing you that this is the case than the actual participants in the peace process from the U.S. side can do in their own words. So, for example, a fellow by the name of Dennis Ross, he was the key U.S. peace process player during the Bush years, Bush 1, during the Clinton years. And he wrote in his book, The Missing Piece, that his job was not to be a mediator, not to be an honest broker, not to be a peace seeker, but to be a seller. And in his words, what he said is that our MO was to sell. And he said what we would do is take Israeli ideas, or ideas that Israel could live with, and work them over to make them more attractive to the Arabs and to get the Arabs to scale back their expectations. Now, under what definition of being an honest broker does this type of admission fall? This is not how an honest broker behaves toward a conflict. This is the superpower of the world tag teaming with the oppressor to maintain a situation of oppression. This is not honest brokering. Ross's successor was a fellow by the name of Aaron David Miller, who worked on this issue during the Clinton years and during the Bush 2 years. And Aaron David Miller put it even more succinctly. In 2005, he wrote in the Washington Post that we have acted as Israel's lawyers, catering to every Israeli whim at the expense of having successful negotiations. And he said something that I very fundamentally agree with, which is that if the United States is going to play a role in brokering Israeli-Palestinian peace, we can have one client only. And that client is not Israel. That client is the requirements of a just and lasting peace. So as I wrote this book, I asked myself, did President Barack Obama approach this issue from a fundamentally different vantage point and understanding than his predecessors? Or did he continue this tradition of us functioning as Israel's lawyers? And I came up with an equivocal answer. So let me give you a few on the one hand, and then I'm going to give you a few on the other hand. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are today. On the one hand, there's no doubt that President Barack Obama entered the White House with more contact and more understanding of the Palestinian people and Palestinian Americans than any other U.S. president, including Jimmy Carter. It's not even close, the comparison. Because as a state senator in Illinois, Barack Obama had a large constituency of Palestinian Americans. And it was a normal thing for him to attend community functions and to go to the homes of prominent Palestinian academics in his community for dinner, and even to fundraise from the community. And from remarks that he made to Palestinian activists in Chicago, which I quote in my book, it's quite clear that Barack Obama had a lot of empathy for the Palestinian narrative of suffering and dispossession under Israeli rule. Now, this would be a much easier story to tell if Barack Obama jettisons these beliefs when he entered the White House. But he didn't, at least not initially. Some of you may remember what I thought was Obama's best foreign policy speech. Entitled A New Beginning. And what President Obama said in Cairo was truly path-breaking. He said that it is, quote, undeniable that the Palestinian people have suffered in pursuit of a homeland, Muslims and Christians alike. And he talked about Palestinian refugees languishing in refugee camps, unable to lead the life of peace and security that they deserve. And he talked about the daily humiliations that Palestinians face under Israeli military occupation. No sitting U.S. president had said anything like this in office. Jimmy Carter has come close after office, but no U.S. president had said anything like this while in the White House. 2. The second reason why Barack Obama was fundamentally different from his predecessors on this issue is because he broke with this U.S. tradition of appointing a clear pro-Israel ideologue to broker Israeli-Palestinian peace. So, instead of someone like Dennis Ross, remember this character who referred to his job as selling Israeli ideas to the Palestinians and then wondering why it didn't work? Instead of appointing someone like him, Obama appointed the former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. This was the same George Mitchell who acted as an honest broker to broker an end to 8 centuries of communal fighting in Northern Ireland. This was the same George Mitchell who in 2001, at the height of the Palestinian Intifada against Israeli military occupation, at a time when public sentiment was so universally hostile to Palestinians in this country, George Mitchell actually came up with a fairly balanced report and set of recommendations on how to get the peace process back on track, as he was asked to by George W. Bush. And in this report, Mitchell says that Israel had to stop colonizing Palestinian lands in order for there to be a chance to resume negotiations and have them be successful. So the fact that Mitchell was appointed by Obama on the second day after he entered the White House was a clear signal. A clear signal that policy was going to change. And the Israel lobby was apoplectic and nervous about Mitchell's appointment. So much so that Abe Foxman, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, actually wrote an article condemning the Obama administration, get this, for daring to pursue a policy of neutrality. Because the Israel lobby doesn't want the United States to be neutral. God forbid the United States should actually take the side of the oppressed. The Israel lobby does not want the United States to be neutral. The Israel lobby wants the United States to be Israel's lawyers in these negotiations. But the Palestinians, on the other hand, were ecstatic over Mitchell's appointment. And we know this thanks to the documents that were leaked from within the Palestinian negotiating team to Al Jazeera in 2011. And what we know from these documents, which I write about in my book, is that the Palestinian negotiating team was actually reading Mitchell's book on how he brokered peace in Northern Ireland. And they said, my goodness, if Mitchell applies these principles of conflict resolution to us, we might actually get the fair shake out of Washington that we have never had. The third reason why Obama was very different from his predecessors, and especially Clinton and Bush, was because of his early and frequent and vehement and insistent demand that Israel had to fulfill its prior obligations to stop colonizing the Palestinian land that it was supposedly negotiating with the Palestinians to establish a state on. Obama was quite firm early in his administration that Israel had to do this in order for there to be a chance of negotiations succeeding. So if Obama understood this, that Israeli colonization had to stop, if he appointed someone who truly could have been an honest broker, and if he had a level of empathy for the Palestinian people that no other U.S. president had, what went wrong? Why was Obama not able to make any progress toward Israeli-Palestinian peace? And why is the policy today, in 2013, actually worse than it was in 2009 when he entered the White House? So let me give you on the other hand. On the other hand, Barack Obama continued many of the themes of U.S. policy toward Israel and the Palestinians that had torpedoed previous U.S. efforts to broker Israeli-Palestinian peace. Number one, like every U.S. president since Richard Nixon, Barack Obama dramatically increased the amount of weapons that we as taxpayers provide to Israel to maintain its oppression of the Palestinian people. When Barack Obama entered the White House, we were giving Israel $2.55 billion of weapons every year. Today, that figure is $3.1 billion. Now, under international law, when you provide a party to a conflict with weapons, you have broken the laws of neutrality. And you have declared yourself to be on the side of the party that you are arming. So just as Russia has broken the laws of neutrality by arming the Assad regime in Syria, the United States has broken the laws of neutrality by arming Israel. So it's ludicrous to pretend that the United States can be an honest broker to this conflict as long as we arm Israel to continue its oppression of the Palestinian people. It simply doesn't make sense. It's illogical. Now, to make matters worse, in 2007, George W. Bush negotiated an agreement to give Israel $30 billion out of our pockets in weapons to Israel from 2009 to 2018. Barack Obama wants to do more. So, early on in his second term, when he went to Jerusalem in March of this year, he announced that he wanted to extend U.S. military aid to Israel beyond this agreement that Bush signed, even though Israel has a higher per capita GDP than does Spain, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea. And what Obama said, when he leaked to the press actually, was that he wants to cut a deal to give Israel $40 billion of additional weapons until 2028. How are we going to bring Israeli-Palestinian peace when we are arming Israel to the teeth to continue its oppressive structure towards the Palestinian people? Now, when he promised this, this was at the same time that we were facing in this country sequestration, across-the-board budget cuts to nearly every single social spending program that hundreds of millions of our fellow citizens rely upon for the basics of life. Now, the effect, well, there's been many effects of sequestration. We can talk about the cut in food stamps. But let's talk about the fact that because of sequestration, the United States government supposedly doesn't have money to provide to seniors to pay for cancer-fighting drugs. Yet, we can magically turn up $40 billion to give to weapons in Israel to maim and injure and kill Palestinian civilians. What does that say about our priorities as a country? The second reason why Obama was not at all different from his predecessors is because, like other U.S. presidents, when faced with pressure from the Israel lobby, he acceded to that pressure. And Obama just didn't agree to the demands of the Israel lobby. He completely folded before these demands. And he did so very clearly and very early on in his administration. And this is why, after the summer of 2009, the policy had this scattershot, frenetic lurching back and forth, and it was clear that there was no strategy. So what happened? When Obama said, Israel, you have to stop colonizing Palestinian land, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, mobilized 77 U.S. senators to send a letter to Obama undermining his foreign policy and to tell him to knock it off. It was a cease and desist letter. And Obama, instead of taking his case to the public, folded before this pressure. He could have stood up and gone on national television and said, I firmly believe that if we're going to have a credible negotiating process, that Israel has to stop colonizing Palestinian land. Had he done so, he would have found that 80% of Americans agreed with him at that time, according to public opinion polls. But instead, Obama listened to what the Israel lobby had to say. So you remember this character, Abe Foxman, who was just condemning the Obama administration for a supposed policy of neutrality. Now, in the summer of 2009, he's meeting behind closed doors with other organizations of the pro-Israel lobby and asking Obama to please now pursue a policy of neutrality. And what Abe Foxman tells Obama is that we're not being neutral. Now we're not being neutral. We're not being neutral because you are insisting that Israel stop expanding settlements on Palestinian land. And this is what Obama told him, and this is a direct quote from an investigatory report published in the Washington Post in 2012. He said, Abe, you are absolutely right. The sense of even-handedness has to be restored, and I'm going to restore it. But what Obama did from that point forward was not to restore even-handedness, but to restore the status quo ante, to return U.S. policy to exactly how it was before he entered the White House. In other words, to continue acting as Israel's lawyers. And the way this worked itself out was that Obama appointed this same character, Dennis Ross, the one who referred to his job as selling Israeli ideas to the Palestinians. And he placed him at the NSC, the National Security Council. And he said, from now on, you're going to be my, quote, quarterback on all Middle East issues. And from that perch at the NSC, what Ross proceeded to do was to systematically undercut and undermine George Mitchell, and to prevent him from being the honest broker that he knew he needed to be. And he quit in frustration in 2011, having accomplished nothing. The third reason why the Obama administration was not so different from its predecessors is because that we continued, to a tremendous extent, the policy of protecting Israel at the UN, of making sure that Israel is never held accountable for its violation of dozens of UN Security Council resolutions, is never held accountable for its daily violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention in terms of its military occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, and to make sure that it gets away, literally, with murder, and not only murder, but with war crimes. Now, I don't use the term war crimes lightly, and I don't think anybody should. It's a very serious charge. So what am I referring to? After Israel bombarded in the most barbaric fashion the blockaded Gaza Strip, where 1.7 million Palestinians live under the most dire circumstances imaginable because Israel prevents them from getting adequate food and drinking water and health care and other basic necessities of life through this blockade. In December 2008 and January of 2009, Israel launched a murderous assault on these blockaded Palestinians, killing 1,400 Palestinians, the vast majority of whom were civilians, including hundreds of children over the course of 3 weeks. Now, the UN Human Rights Council established a fact-finding mission to determine the actions and the responsibilities of the parties to this conflict. And they found, this was called the Goldstone Report, named after the judge who headed the delegation. The Goldstone Report found in 575 pages of truly heartbreaking detail, some of the stories I document in the book, how both Israel and Palestinian militant groups, for that matter, committed human rights abuses, violations of international law, war crimes, and possible crimes against humanity. Now, when this report came out, President Obama was winning his Nobel Peace Prize in September 2009. And instead of standing up and saying, in the spirit of receiving this Nobel Peace Prize, I firmly believe that anybody who commits a war crime should be held accountable. Instead of doing that, what the Obama administration did was to work systematically to undermine and kill the Goldstone Report, and to prevent Israel from being held accountable in the Security Council or in the International Criminal Court. And we know this thanks to Chelsea Manning's leaks to WikiLeaks. Because in some of these documents, you can see exactly how the United States mobilized all of its diplomatic prowess to kill this report. So there's one cable with the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, who wore her pro-Israel emotions on her sleeve. There's one such cable that reports on a meeting she held with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel, a guy by the name of Dani Ayalon. And what Susan Rice says in this cable is that she was so glad for the close cooperation between the U.S. and Israeli delegations to the UN to work together to, quote, blunt the effects of the Goldstone Report. Now, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton sent out a cable to all U.S. ambassadors instructing them on how they should lobby their host governments to vote against this Goldstone Report. And one of the talking points, get this, one of the talking points issued to U.S. ambassadors was that countries should vote against the Goldstone Report because if Israel is held accountable for its war crimes, this will damage the prospects for the peace process. So, in Obama's view, it's not the fact that Israel is committing war crimes that is problematic, but that it might be held accountable for committing those war crimes. And this pattern of protecting Israel at the UN occurred again and again and again during the Obama administration. The United States has issued exactly one veto in the Security Council in the 5 years of the Obama administration. And that was done in February of 2011 to, get this, veto a resolution condemning Israel's settlement activities, after the Obama administration had spent its first 2 years doing the exact same thing, condemning Israel's settlement activities. So how does Susan Rice explain this apparent contradiction? She said in the Security Council, part of the public record, "Don't construe our vote here today to mean that we agree or accept Israel's settlement activities. But," there's always a but in the U.S. foreign policy, "but if the Security Council passes this resolution, this will damage the prospects for the peace process." So again, it's not, problem isn't Israel's colonization of Palestinian land. In the Obama administration's view, the problem is that the Security Council might do anything about it. So where are we today? Some people believe that when a president gets elected to a second term, they have more freedom to maneuver, they can stand more on principle, they can push their own agenda harder, they can stand further apart from the lobbying interests that set and constrict the political agenda on every single issue today. Well, in the case of Obama, at least on this issue, the opposite is true. And the policy today is worse than it was in the first term. Let me give you 2 reasons why I think that's the case. Number one, during the first term of the Obama administration, the United States tried earnestly at the beginning, and then afterwards at least made a pretense of trying to stop Israel's colonization of Palestinian land. Today, it's out and outright collusion between the United States and Israel on this matter. Since these talks resumed in July, Israel has announced the expansion of more than 5,000 settlement units on Palestinian land. So a reporter asked John Kerry the logical question: do you expect that Israel is going to continue to do this, announce the expansion of settlements, while the parties are sitting down and talking? And John Kerry said, yes, we understand that Israel is going to be making these announcements, expanding settlements, but we don't want that to be an obstacle to the success of these negotiations. How can they not be? How can Israel continue to gobble up Palestinian land under this sham pretense of sitting down and negotiating for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on this land? It's a sham. And the United States is in collusion with Israel in this process. 2, Obama's not making a good faith effort to broker Israeli-Palestinian peace in this term, his second term. And I say that because the person who he appointed to be the special envoy to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations is a fellow by the name of Martin Indyk. Martin Indyk, before working for the U.S. government, was an employee of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. How is this possible? Do we learn nothing from the mistakes of history? To me, this really brings to mind Einstein's definition of insanity, which is to do the same thing over and over again and expect that somehow you're going to get a different result out of it. You are not. It's going to be the exact same result: more Israeli colonization of Palestinian land. So what does this mean for people who are concerned and wanting to see a just and lasting peace between Palestinians and Israelis? What does it mean for people who are concerned and want Palestinians to achieve the freedom, justice, equality, and self-determination that have been denied to them through Israel's apartheid rule over the last 65 plus years? To me, it's very clear. To me, it's clear that there's 2 conclusions. Conclusion number 1 is that we cannot rely upon the politicians to do the right thing of their own volition, no matter how well-intentioned or empathetic they may be on a personal level. This is not about personalities. It's not about individuals. This is not the way that Washington works. This is not the way that U.S. policy is made. And Barack Obama, with his extensive record of having 2 years in federal office before becoming president, assumed the office under the mistaken notion that if you give a great speech about a policy issue, that will lead to policy change. Let me tell you, that is not the way that Washington works. Policy doesn't change because you make a nice speech about something. So no matter how sympathetic the person in the White House may be, they are not going to bring peace on their own, because the Israel lobby, which for the most part sets the agenda for U.S. policy toward Israel and the Palestinian people, doesn't want us to be well-intentioned, doesn't want us to be an honest broker, doesn't want us to establish a policy that would lead to the fulfillment of human rights for the Palestinian people. Instead, we want to be Israel's lawyers in perpetuity. So to get the dynamics of the politics to change, we have to push the politicians in that direction. Because if they don't hear from us, if we don't mount pressure against them, then this feeds into this dynamic that the only people that they're hearing from on this issue is the Israel lobby. Politicians do not make decisions based on morality. This is not how Washington works. They do it on a political calculus. So if they're not hearing from their constituents demanding a different policy, then they're going to follow the path of least resistance, which is to continue with this degraded and debased status quo of a policy. Number two, we as international civil society need to take matters into our own hands. We need to take matters into our own hands by affecting the policies of the institutions with which we are affiliated. And more concretely, what we need to do is we need to respond to what Palestinian civil society is asking us to do, to help them lift the boot of oppression off of their necks. And that's to engage in campaigns of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, against institutions that profiteer from its human rights abuses of Palestinians, and against institutions that are complicit in propagating this false notion that Israel is a democracy. Israel is not a democracy. Israel is a democracy like South Africa was a democracy under apartheid. Israel is a democracy like the United States was a democracy in 1776. Yeah, you could vote if you were a white male who owned substantial property, but if you weren't, you're out of luck. So Israel is a democracy, or more accurately an ethnocracy, for some of its citizens, but not at all for the millions of Palestinians over whom it rules, directly and indirectly. Now, the way that this movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions can work to change the dynamic is to isolate and delegitimate Israel's apartheid policies toward the Palestinian people. Make no mistake about it. Yes, this is about delegitimizing Israel's policies toward the Palestinian people, because apartheid is not legitimate. Apartheid should be delegitimated. And what we're doing is we are pulling out, one by one, the pillars of institutional support that enable and sustain Israel's apartheid policies toward the Palestinians. Now, people ask me, how long will this go on? The answer is, I don't know. One never knows with social change. All of the people who I talked to who were involved with the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa told me that they never believed that they would see an end to apartheid in South Africa in their lifetime. But lo and behold, when enough pillars supporting this policy of apartheid were pulled out, the entire structure crumbled. And let's be very clear. Israel's apartheid policies toward the Palestinians are teetering today. They are on the verge of collapse. This cannot go on much longer, not in 2013. And the only thing that is holding up the process of the Israel of today becoming Israel the international pariah of tomorrow is this sham peace process, is this sham notion that Israel is working in good faith to achieve a just resolution to the conflict. The wool cannot be pulled over the eyes of the international community for much longer. In fact, it's hard to find someone who actually believes the contrary, that Israel is engaged in good faith efforts to negotiate peace. The charade is coming to an end, and together, people of all faiths and religions and backgrounds and ethnicities and nationalities are going to work together to upend and topple the system of Israeli apartheid, which will set the conditions for a just and lasting peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Thank you.